I defended my dissertation on Russian anti-fascism over 10 years ago, and I'm very glad to be here because at the time nobody was interested in these topics. So I moved very quickly onto other issues and didn't really make a book out of it because, at the time everybody thought it was all marginal. So it's nice to be able to revisit the topic after so many years. The working title that was proposed to me was something like The Memory of Soviet Anti-Fascism, implying, to my understanding, that there was a primary phenomenon, which was Soviet anti-fascism during the war, and now we can talk about sort of secondary representations of it. That is not the approach that I'm going to take. The phenomena that I'm going to talk about, which started in the post-war period, are phenomena that can be studied in their own right. But of course, it's very important to have some basic understanding of what official Soviet anti-fascism was, because there is a certain path dependency, and more recent varieties of Russian anti-fascism responded to Soviet anti-fascism. So what was Soviet official anti-fascism? Going very quickly. Sorry. Yeah. And I'm talking here about the after-war period, so after 1945, and mostly anti-fascism for domestic use. So there was, of course, the hallowed formula by Georgy Dimitrov from 1934-1935. Fascism is the open terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary elements of finance capital, which was repeated in every academic and propagandistic publication about fascism produced in the Soviet Union. However, if you look at the actual practical uses of the terminology of fascism and anti-fascism in the post-war Soviet Union, you will find, the Soviet Anti-Fascist Committee is also important to mention. As I said this morning, there was not just the Jewish one, but also the Women's Committee, Youth Committee, Pan-Slavic Committee, etc. So that was kind of the bedrock of this discourse. But they were, as Jochen said, aimed very much at foreign consumption. So domestically, fascism in its actual practical use was defined relationally. It wasn't defined by a set of characteristics, anti-Semitism, cult of personality, etc. It was defined as the ideology or the country or the leader who is at any given moment seen as the Soviet Union's worst designated enemy. Right? So this definition, this use, was actually very rigorous, but it wasn't based on a set of characteristics that you can tick off. Right? So at different times, a vast range of people and countries could be referred to as fascist in Soviet discourse. So Adolf Hitler, of course. Mussolini, very rarely, you will find very, very few publications from the post-war Soviet Union about fascism that actually refer to Italy and Mussolini. However, of course, Tito was a fascist during the rift between Stalin and Tito. Zionism was fascistic, and so was Adenauer and the West German revanchist regime that he stood for. Right? And even as late as the 1960s and 70s, the Israeli Zionist regime was associated in Soviet propaganda, including Soviet domestic propaganda, with fascism. Right? So whoever was the Soviet Union's worst enemy on the domestic and especially on the international stage was fascist, right? And that is the kind of the discourse that a lot of people grew up with in the post-war decades. So what came after Soviet anti-fascism, or what were the reactions to this culture of anti-fascist propaganda? And I want to very quickly in this talk take you through several of them. One I will call liberal anti-fascism. The second one is ironic anti-fascism, known in Russian as stop. Then there is subcultural anti-fascism. And then there's the new Kremlin anti-fascism that we've been seeing in recent years. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of these. So let's start with liberal anti-fascism. This is something that started developing in the 1960s, very much as a response to official propaganda about fascism. And it developed as an Aesopian fascism. What does that mean? A milieu of liberal, very often Jewish, highly educated intellectuals, mostly in Moscow and Leningrad, started thinking about parallels between, as they saw it, the two totalitarian regimes, Nazi Germany and the Stalinist regime in the Soviet Union, and used publications that were ostensibly, or cultural products that were ostensibly about Nazi Germany to make a very veiled point about Stalinism and Soviet totalitarianism. So to give you some examples, the most celebrated documentary film about German National Socialism that was produced in the Soviet Union in 1966, Ordinary Fascism, which was based on archival and trophy footage, documentary footage, was in the intentions of some of the film's producers and makers, among other things, a sort of veiled reference to the Stalinist system. And we know from responses at the time that that veiled reference was understood not by the millions and millions of people who watched the film, but certainly by a certain urban milieu that then responded to it by creating samizdat publications that made the point much more explicitly, etc. Another wonderful example is the only Hitler biography that was ever published in the Soviet Union, Criminal Number One, right? And I won't go into the detail, that's actually in the forthcoming book. But basically the idea was that instead of talking about the fascist system as an outgrowth of capitalism, which would have been the standard interpretive frame, the authors talked about Hitler as a person, using that biographical genre to make some extremely veiled references to these parallels. So basically this liberal anti-fascism developed as a kind of very twisted Aesopian critique of the Soviet Union's own system in these intellectual milieus, and among other things, it was also directed against the Russian nationalist enemies of that milieu within the cultural apparatus. So it was very much part of a kind of cultural civil war, politics by culture, as some authors have called it, between the 1960s and the 1980s, which was kind of a struggle about censorship, resources, access to the Central Committee, etc. And then this informed the first responses to the public appearance of anti-Semitic Russian ultranationalism in 1987. So there had been a very strong, very vocal undercurrent of Russian nationalism, anti-Semitic Russian nationalism in the Soviet period, but it was never openly demonstrated in the public square until Perestroika made that possible. And in 1987, there were some first very public and publicized demonstrations by new, albeit very, very small anti-Semitic groups in Moscow, in the center of Moscow on Manich Square, and in Leningrad on Rumyantsev Square, and the first anti-fascist groups that formed in the final years of the Soviet Union were formed by liberal intellectuals in response to these demonstrations, and basically drew on these parallels that people had been drawing since the 1960s, right? So the idea was that the Soviet regime was essentially more or less like German Nazism, and the new anti-Semitic Russian nationalist groups were essentially combining the two, right? So they were giving rise to a red-brown coalition of Russian nationalists, anti-Semites, and also unreconstructed communists. And liberal anti-fascism was a response to that, which in turn led to a phenomenon that may look very strange from a Western perspective, which was the idea of anti-fascist authoritarianism. So many liberal anti-fascists at the time, well into the 1990s, even the early 2000s, called for an anti-fascist Pinochet in Russia. The idea being that there's a red-brown coalition about to take power, so we need a strong authoritarian government to get rid of the communists the way Pinochet did in Chile, right? So I won't go into the kind of the complexities of this idea, but it was very popular at the time. I would interpret this through the lens of what I call political obstetrics and social epidemiology. So social epidemiology is clear. It's the kind of the age-old model that fascism is a disease. It's a virus that's spreading through society, which of course relies on an organicist vision of society. And political obstetrics refers to what the Marxist philosopher Jerry Cohen said about Marxism, where he said that Marxists have a midwife conception of history, where the direction of history is clear, but it needs a little bit of help to really sort of come out. Whereas here, it was a conception that very much relied on the idea that we have to abort this development, right? So something terrible is being born, and if we all get together as liberal anti-fascists, we can get rid of this terrible red-brown danger once and for all. It will be aborted, and it will never come back. So just in a nutshell, that is a discursive formation that was very, very strong in the 1990s in particular. But what's interesting about it is that when I interviewed many of the protagonists of this movement, but also when I looked at archival documents, so letters that were sent to the Leningrad City Committee in the late 1980s and 1990 in response to these first nationalist demonstrations, in the vast majority of cases, these anti-fascist activists and concerned citizens didn't refer to universal principles. It wasn't about, fascism is evil because, etc. It was mostly about a sense of place. So usually they would say, well, we cannot tolerate fascism in Leningrad, because Leningrad is the cradle of the revolution, it's the city of Lenin, etc. We cannot tolerate fascism in Rumyantsev Square, because, of course, it's surrounded by Leningrad University, the Academy of Sciences, all these hallowed institutions of higher learning, which are ours. They belong to us, liberal, often Jewish intellectuals, so we won't let the evil nationalists come and take them. So it was very much a symbolic struggle, but a symbolic struggle that felt very intimate and like a high-stakes struggle to these people, even though at the time there was actually a surprisingly low level of anti-Semitic violence. Even though a lot of people had feared massive pogroms, they didn't materialize until a much later period and were directed mostly against people from the south rather than Jews. And in Moscow it was the same. The terrible thing for these anti-fascists was that the anti-Semites had demonstrated on a central square in Moscow, in the heart of the capital. So it was mostly about defending a sense of place and not so much defending a universal anti-fascist principle. Let's switch to Styob anti-fascism. So many of you may not have heard this term. Styob is something that developed in the final decades of the Soviet Union and has been defined by the anthropologist Alexei Yurchak, who wrote a book about it, as a kind of ironic form of over-identification with something that ostensibly you're criticizing, right? So you're criticizing Soviet official propagandistic discourse by blending with it. So think Stephen Colbert or The Onion, but 1970s or 80s Soviet Union, right? It was there before it appeared in the West. So this is distinct from simply trying to provoke the Soviet state. So in the 1980s, there were quite a number of youth groups that paraded in Nazi uniforms, celebrated Hitler's birthday in the streets of Moscow, which gave rise to kind of street brawls, etc. But that was very much, at the time, still part of a game where the idea was, well, they tell us that the Nazis are the worst, so we're going to be the worst. We're going to provoke them. We're going to kind of show our independence. But gradually then, this morphed into a kind of more Styob style of irony, where people would take iconic Soviet cultural products, like the most celebrated television series ever produced in the Soviet Union, 17 Moments in Spring, which was about a Soviet spy who masks as a Nazi official and basically single-handedly brings down Nazi Germany. And all these Nazis in the series were played by some of the most popular, the sexiest Soviet actors. So it gave rise to a whole culture of Styob, where people would sort of make jokes about this and then, eventually come to almost identify with these figures in a way where, in the end, it wasn't clear anymore whether they were making fun of the Soviet Union or of the Nazis or identifying with both. And that was actually very, very influential. And then in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of something called the National Bolshevik Party, which actually presented itself as a real political party and indeed became a very widespread youth movement, which tried to combine elements of left and right-wing radicalism and symbolism in ways that very much were informed and influenced by Styob. And there were lots and lots of phenomena like that. So National Bolsheviks, where this is a band that in, I think, the early 2000s released a song that was called A Negro Has Been Killed, giving rise to lots of discussions about whether they were racist or really anti-racist. So the defining feature of this Styob anti-fascism was that you always need to add an additional interpretive layer. You can't just take the phenomenon at face value. Whenever you see something like this, there'll be a very emotional debate about, is this really fascism? Is this really anti-fascism? What did they really mean when they said this? And you can't kind of divorce the cultural product from that debate. And that became really influential for kind of the post-Soviet political culture in Russia in general. So there was post-socialist Styob essentially before there was Western Styob, but people like Yurchak have applied the concept of Styob in, I think, very interesting ways to Western cultural phenomena. So in post-socialism, of course, we have Neue Slowenische Kunst from Slovenia, which played with Nazi symbolism in similar ways. We have a famous story from Poland where a Polish artist did an exhibition of famous actors who played Nazis, and one of those actors, the famous Polish actor Daniel Olbrychski, was so shocked by this that he came into the exhibition room with a saber and destroyed some of these photos. But then today, you have phenomena such as the US alt-right, where if you look in detail at the biographies of some of the most prominent alt-right activists, you can see that many of them started out as kind of semi-adolescent online trolls who were basically trying to play this online provocation game and then eventually ended up sort of more or less serious alt-right activists, right? So this is something that's very familiar from a late socialist and post-socialist perspective. Then we have subcultural anti-fascism, which will probably be much more familiar to you because it's similar to what we've seen in Western Europe since the 1960s. So it developed essentially in Russia, but very widely across urban Russia, due to the import of musical subcultures, DIY punk, rap, etc., that were inspired by Western models, mediated by punk scenes in Belarus and St. Petersburg, etc., and then, by the early 2000s, essentially had spread across the entire country. Very often, the anti-fascist street scene is connected with the DIY punk music scene, so they will engage just as their Western equivalents do in Food Not Bombs actions. They talk a lot about local actions. They organize concerts. There's a kind of straight edge aspect, so no drinking, no drugs, etc. And here you see some pictures. And what's interesting is that they will very often engage in fights with Nazi skinheads. And in my interviews in provincial Russia, Western Siberia, Karelia, etc., usually the story that I heard was, well, we went to this concert, our town is small, so there was only one concert venue for everyone. Nazi bands started to play there, and then their fans would start beating us up, so we decided to resist, right? That's the kind of the narrative about the development of anti-fascism. But what's interesting is that there's also a lot of circulation between these different scenes. And one sociologist who studied youth cultures in Russia, Hilary Pilkington, speaks of a youth stage, which I think is a very apt term, because you get this image of there being a single stage for everyone, which very often is, physically the one public square or the one Lenin street in a provincial town where everybody has to congregate, the skaters, the rappers, the DIY punk people, the Nazis, etc. And there's a kind of fight over that stage. And then once people are on that stage, there's also a lot of fluidity. So I heard stories about people starting out as neo-Nazis in some Nazi band, and then moving on to anti-fascism, and then moving back to the Nazis, but becoming kind of a straight-edge Nazi musician. And there's a lot of that fluidity. But what's also interesting is that on the one hand, there's in that anti-fascist scene, there is a constant search for authenticity. So there's a lot of talk about, we have to do everything ourselves, DIY ethos. We have to conform to the models of, 1960s British punk, because everything that came afterwards is inauthentic, right? So there's a lot of debate about which bands are authentic, which bands have sold out, etc. At the same time, there is an impressive degree of self-awareness and self-irony. So in my interviews, I heard things like an 18-year-old somewhere in Tomsk telling me, well, of course I know that most people in this anti-fascist scene come from broken homes, and then probably once we're fully integrated in real professional life, we will leave all this stuff behind. So there's a lot of kind of self-deprecating ironic narratives about their involvement in these anti-fascist scenes. But at the same time, the violence and the street fighting and the dying is very real in many of these cases. And the last, and also just like the liberal anti-fascists before them, the street anti-fascists or subcultural anti-fascists very often are about specific places. So once again, in their discourse, it's not so much about, global equality or, defending, upholding some general anti-fascist principles, although there is a little bit of that. But very often it's about, we have to defend our turf against the Nazis in our town, right? So just to show you some of the scenes, some of the stages where this happens, this is Petrozavodsk, Kirov, this is Tomsk, and all of these are places, easily, where people from different subcultures congregate and basically fight over this turf, and then decide who belongs to what subculture. And there are, okay, I won't go into the details. And this gives rise to a lot of interesting questions about what these scenes actually are. How do we conceptualize them? Are they subcultures? Are they post-subcultures? Are they political movements, as a lot of people in Russia have wanted to call them, the Antifa movement? Are they just street gangs? And what I think is the interesting thing about them is that they basically fluctuate between these three, and there's a little bit of each of them in this sort of subcultural anti-fascist culture. And then finally, what we've been seeing more recently in the 2000s with Putin in particular is what I would call the new Kremlin anti-fascism. And this has to do with the renewed importance of Great Patriotic War commemoration. Great Patriotic War, for those of you not familiar with the term, is the war between 1941 and 45, so after Hitler's attack on the Soviet Union, which a lot of people have assumed has been kind of imposed from above by the Kremlin. If you look at it empirically in detail, you'll see that that's not true. There's a generational dynamic, etc. But this is a phenomenon that is very strong in Russia and many other post-Soviet republics today. And at the same time, we saw since 2003 at the latest that the Kremlin was groping around for a response to the Ukrainian Orange Revolution, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, so all these the political upheaval happening around Russia, but also the beginnings of political street protest, the extra-parliamentary opposition in Russia. And it found this in among other things, a rediscovery of anti-fascist rhetoric. So many of you might have heard of the anti-fascist youth movement Nasze, which was founded in 2003 by the Kremlin, and which many of its detractors labeled a kind of Putin-Jugend, but which in its self-presentation very actively used this anti-fascist imagery. This is now defunct, but there are many successor movements. One of the most interesting ones today is called Essence of the Time, Суть времени, which is a vast movement that has offshoots in dozens of countries, literally, and is not entirely dependent on the Kremlin, but is funded by the Kremlin, and very heavily relies on the sort of Soviet patriotic discourse of victory in the war. And it's important to understand the strength of this new official anti-fascism, to think back to the way that official anti-fascism worked in the post-war Soviet Union. Namely, anti-fascism was not against anti-Semitism, racism, etc. It was about identifying the worst enemy of the Soviet state. So today, so here you see these movements, today there are new fascists, namely Estonia, Ukraine, Germany when it criticizes Russia, etc. And once again, it's usually not about identifying a certain set of fascist characteristics. It's about basically linking political change, for example, regime change in Ukraine or Georgia, to the idea that these countries are disrespecting the Soviet victory in the Second World War. So whenever a monument is being moved, whenever there's a march of SS veterans in a Baltic country, etc. This is taken in official Russian pronouncements as a sign that fascism is on the rise. So disrespecting the sort of the Soviet World War achievements is tantamount to building a fascist regime, which goes some way towards explaining that you can be a Russian anti-fascist today and be essentially racist, homophobic, etc., because that's not seen as part of the anti-fascist canon. So the result of this development is essentially that anti-fascist discourse has increasingly become, has sort of fallen out of fashion with people who don't want to toe the Kremlin line. And activists who really want to struggle against the kind of fashion that is defined by anti-Semitism, racism, etc., increasingly will call themselves anti-racists, or use any number of new terms, but will try to avoid this terminology of anti-fascism. I'll stop here.